This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nietzahone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I normally rank the best cards in the game based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition, but sometimes it's fun to look at the opposite end of the spectrum, and that's what we're doing today with a look at the worst cards on Magic Arena. Most of my top 10s that look at the worst cards in the game heavily feature older sets that tend to have more bad cards in them than sets today do, so sometimes it's nice to set parameters that only allow me to look at newer cards. This does generally mean the worst cards on this list aren't quite as terrible as they are on broader worst lists, but rest assured these cards are still awful. While the cards that appear on this list and the order in which they appear is left up to my own opinion, there are some important things that have to be true about a card for it to show up on this list. Namely, it has to be bad in Magic's three main play modes, that is 40 card limited, 60 card constructed, and 99 card commander. Additionally, the card has to have always been bad. In other words, for a card to truly be considered one of the worst ever, it has to be bad everywhere and for all of that card's history. I used EDHREC as an indicator of how heavily played a card is in Commander. I would use Brawl data, but that's much harder to get enough of for it to truly be meaningful. I use top finishes at Premier events and Magic Online and Magic Arena events for 60 card formats. Normally there isn't data for me to rely on for the 40 card formats, but one of the nice things about looking at Magic Arena is that there is limited data for most cards on MTG Arena thanks to 17 Lands, a website that tracks limited data on Arena, and something I highly recommend to help you improve in Limited. Check out 17lands.com if you're interested. Not every card in this list has limited data, either because it's older than 17 lands or because it was never in a limited format, but when it is available, I've included the limited win rates of these cards. Alright, with that out of the way, here are my picks for the 10 worst cards on Magic Arena. At number 10, I have both Scath Zombies and Canal Monitor. They are here representing all of the bad vanilla creatures on Magic Arena. A vanilla creature is one without any abilities, and if you're a creature with no other effects, you had better have an efficient stat line. Both of these cards fall well short of clearing that bar. Scath Zombies is a black gray ogre, in other words a 3-mana 2/2, and it was originally printed in Alpha, Magic's very first set, but it's also one of the cards you get in the Magic Arena starter pack. Canal Monitor is a 5-mana 5/3, which is probably worse than a 3-mana 2/2. It hits harder, but it costs more mana and dies to a lot of very cheap cards, which is never a good thing. Still, as bad as these two cards are, there are plenty of worse cards on Magic Arena. At number 9, I've got Keeper of the Cadence. For 4 generic and a blue, you get a 2/5, and you can pay 3 generic to put an artifact, instant, or sorcery from your graveyard on top of your library. This is pretty close to just being a vanilla 5-mana 2/5, a stat line that I think is worse than Scath Zombies or Canal Monitor. Even if this ability could put cards of any type back on the bottom of your library, it wouldn't be good. But they even decided to really restrict Keeper of the Cadence's ability to put cards back by leaving out the two most plentiful card types, creatures and lands. So an ability that would already be bad is even worse. Now, there are corner cases where this ability does something, like if your opponent has a card with one of those types in their graveyard and you're worried about them getting it back, or if you want to get a powerful card from your graveyard back in your library, or if the game goes so long that you can use this to keep yourself from milling out. In fact, if you reach that point in the game, you can basically use this to choose what you draw every turn, which can be pretty powerful. So, those are situations where the ability matters, but those situations all come up an extremely low percentage of the time, and certainly don't make a 5-mana 2/5 worth running in any format. This is the first card on the list where we've got some limited data from 17 lands, so I do want to take a moment to talk about that. A 49.6% win rate might not sound that bad, because the overall win rate in Magic is always 50%. But 17 lands players have significantly higher win rates than the overall win rate. After all, they tend to be people really concerned with improving their limited game. For most formats, the win rate on 17 lands is around 55%, so you can see just how bad 49.6% is when you keep that in mind. However, of all the cards on the list with limited data, this is the one with the highest win rate, which really shows you how bad the rest of the list is. At number 8, I've got Dusk Feaster. For 5 generic and 2 black, it's a 4/5 flyer. That is a terrible stat line, of course, but Dusk Feaster isn't quite that bad because it comes with Delirium. If you have 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, it costs 2 less mana. If this was always a 5-mana 4/5 flyer, it wouldn't be on the list, but that's this card's ceiling, and it isn't exactly an impressive one. You don't feel embarrassed about playing that card, but you don't feel like you're about to shift the game wildly in your favor either. So when the card's floor is that it's an absolutely horrendous 7 mana 4/5 flyer, then it takes some very real work for it to reach its very medium ceiling, we're talking about a pretty bad card. At number 7, it's Moltenravager. For 2 generic into red, it's a 0/4. That's a terrible starting point, and the Ravager's text box doesn't do near enough to overcome its problems, because all it has going on is fire breathing. Now, fire breathing can be good, especially on evasive creatures, but on a 0/4, not so much. A 0/4 can obviously enough not do damage to things. This does get around that problem some because of fire breathing, but the fact you have to sink mana into this just so that it can kill creatures that block it or attack into it is really bad, especially in situations where the best you're going to do is get a trade anyway. In short, the Ravager is incredibly mana intensive, despite the fact that it will generally only have an incredibly small impact on the game. At number 6, I've got 2 cards, Tezzeret's Strider and Watley's Spurring. These are stand-ins for all of the awful Planeswalker deck cards on Magic Arena. While they're all bad, I think these two are the absolute worst. If you don't know, Planeswalker decks are a now-defunct product that was released with every set from 2016 to 2020. It was a starter theme deck for beginning Magic players that featured a face card that was a Planeswalker. While these were a paper-release product, they also made sure that the Planeswalker deck unique cards are available on Arena. These decks largely featured cards from whatever set the deck was associated with, but they also contained a few of those unique cards, including that special Planeswalker. In addition to that, each Planeswalker deck contained a card that could tutor up that specific Planeswalker, and a card that was a payoff for controlling a Planeswalker with the same type as that deck's face Planeswalker. While the Planeswalkers in those decks were generally powered down, none of them are even close to bad enough to show up on a list like this, and I think that's also true of the cards that tutored up those Planeswalkers. However, that isn't true of the cards that pay you off for having Planeswalkers of the right type in play, as I think Tezzeret's Strider and Watley's Spurring very clearly indicate. The Strider is a 3 mana 3/1 that has Menace if you control a Tezzeret Planeswalker. First off, if you don't control a Tezzeret Planeswalker, we're talking about an awful card. I would rather have Scath Zombies than a 3 mana 3/1, and then this card's upside is super underwhelming. Imagine this was a 3 mana 3/1 that always has Menace, and we'd be talking about a pretty bad card, and the Strider will only have it very rarely, even if you're playing a Tezzeret deck. I think Watley's Spurring is probably even worse, because at least the Strider can add to the board. Watley's Spurring, meanwhile, is a 1 red mana instant that gives +2/+0 to a creature, or +4/+0 if you control a Watley Planeswalker. In short, this is a really bad combat trick that doesn't do a very good job of making sure your creature can survive combat, regardless of whether you control a Watley or not. In other words, using this card will usually end up with you getting 2 for 1. It does get slightly more attractive when you imagine using it as a burn spell of sorts to do more damage to your opponent once a creature gets through unblocked, but going down a card for that isn't exactly ideal either. Watley's Spurring is also a good example of what we're going to see on the remainder of the cards in this list, cards that basically don't do anything. So far we've seen creatures, woefully inefficient ones to be sure, but they still have the ability to, do something. The top 5 on this list aren't so lucky, as most of them pretty much do nothing. Like our number 5 card, which is Disturbed Slumber, which is a stand-in for cards that animate lands or artifacts for a single turn. I use Disturbed Slumber as a representative because it's the newest of them. For 1 generic and a green, it's an instant that turns a land into a 4/4 dinosaur with reach and haste until end of turn, and it has to be blocked that turn if able. Cards that allow you to temporarily animate lands or artifacts tend to be bad because they are highly situational and don't give you a way to add to the board in any permanent fashion. It's tempting to look at this and imagine scenarios where you can animate your land and ambush an attacker, or animate a land and force your opponent's creature to block it, but those are not especially common outcomes. First, your opponent has to have creatures with stat lines that line up favorably for a 4/4, and second, your opponent has to do exactly the thing you want them to, whether that is attacking with one of those creatures, or having a creature of the right size left behind as a blocker. Any card where you're that reliant on your opponent doing the exact right thing tends to be pretty bad. Most of the time, Disturbed Slumber and similar effects have a minimal impact on the game, and just end up letting you swing for like 4 damage, or getting blocked by a creature token. Neither of those is generally worth paying 2 mana for, and going down a card. At number 4, it's Elaborate Fire Cannon. For 2 generic mana, this is an artifact that doesn't untap during your untap step. It also has an activated ability that costs 4 generic, and you tap it to do 2 damage to any target, and at the beginning of your upkeep you can discard a card. If you do, you untap the cannon. So even if this just untapped normally, we'd be talking about a card that takes an investment of 6 mana before it does anything, making it an incredibly overcosted source of removal and direct damage. That said, it probably wouldn't be on this list if it didn't come with the incredibly massive downside of not untapping as normal. In order to get more uses out of it, you have to give up a whole card during your upkeep, which really defeats the purpose of having a card that is a repeatable source of removal, as that sort of thing could usually grant you card advantage, but this doesn't do that. You can try to play this in a deck that likes discarding cards and loading the graveyard, and it does get better in those situations. But if you ever need ways to do those things, there are hundreds of better cards that can do it without such a miserable floor. In short, this fire cannon is a little too elaborate, and that's what makes it one of the worst cards on Magic Arena. At number 3, it is the Fall of Krug. For 4 generic and 2 red, you get a sorcery. If you're spending that much on something you can only do during one of your main phases, you should expect something pretty big. The Fall of Krug may well be called the Fail of Krug, though, because it doesn't get anywhere close. Sure, it does have 3 separate effects, but all 3 are incredibly underwhelming. You choose an opponent, destroy land they control, do 3 to them, and 1 damage to each creature they control. That's a lot of words, but most of the time, it'll feel like the Fall of Krug doesn't do anything. For most land destruction to be worth using, it needs to be cheap. This doesn't get there. For direct damage to an opponent to be good, it needs to be cheap. This doesn't get there. For 1 damage to all opposing creatures to be worth it, it needs to be cheap, and this doesn't get there. And sure, you get all 3 in 1 card, and if your opponent has a bunch of X1s and a really problematic land in play, casting this won't feel too terrible. But on most board states, this is the world's worst Lava Axe, and that's a card you should never play in any format. At number 2, I've got Contested Game Ball. For 2 generic mana, this is an artifact with an activated ability. You can pay 2 and tap it to draw a card and put a point counter on it. Then if it has 5 or more point counters on it, you sacrifice it and create a treasure token. The flavor of this card is awesome, but there's a pretty big downside. If your opponent deals combat damage to you, they gain control of Contested Game Ball and untap it. If it were easy to hang on to the game ball, it would actually be a fairly interesting card, as it has the ability to draw you a bunch of cards. It doesn't exactly do its thing efficiently, but it wouldn't be on this list if it drew you 5 cards and spat out a treasure over a sequence of several turns. But the bad news is that the game ball is very easy for your opponent to gain control of. And if you took a turn to play something like the game ball, there's a good chance you don't have creatures in play to keep them from taking it from you. Then your opponent can start drawing cards with it. And sure, you can get it back, but you're almost always going to come out behind in terms of cards and mana because you're the one who spent the mana and the card on casting the game ball, so your opponent is already up a card when you play it. In short, the game ball only works decently for you if you keep it under your control, and that ceiling isn't exactly impressive, while the floor of the card is absolutely miserable. And at number 1, it's Blazing Hope. This is a 1 white mana removal spell that exiles a creature, making it a card that is descended from amazing cards like Swords to Plowshare and Path to Exile. But it doesn't come anywhere close to living up to the success of its forebears, because it can only exile a creature with power greater than or equal to your life total. In other words, this is going to be an effectively blank card in your hand in many situations. Creatures tend to have a lot less power than your life total, especially in the early stages of the game, so the fact this is cheap doesn't really matter. By the late game, this might be capable of taking some stuff down, but if your life total is truly that low, you're probably going to lose. When this card was previewed in Rivals of Ixalan, there was some talk that it might work in Death's Shadow decks in Modern. These decks are all about lowering their life total as quickly as possible so that Death's Shadow can be absolutely massive. You can see why people thought this deck would be the one where Blazing Hope might work. After all, you can use this to get a blocker out of the way super efficiently and then smash in with your huge creature. But things didn't pan out that way. That deck still preferred to have more flexible forms of removal that actually did something before they got their life total low enough for Blazing Hope to ever do its thing, and if a card like that doesn't work in a deck specifically geared towards rapidly lowering their own life total, it isn't going to work anywhere. So those are my picks for the 10 worst cards on Magic Arena. If you want to own any of these cards for some reason, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.